What did Alexander the Great eat? And other mundane matters of conquest? You are lying back, the world around you growing quieter. The faint sound of sandals scuffing on packed earth emerges in your mind. Ahead stretches a seemingly endless road, through Anatolia. The year is roughly 334 BCE, and you are with the army of Alexander III of Macedon, whom history would come to call Alexander the Great. But tonight, there are no battles, no charges of cavalry, no sieges, just dinner. Alexander the Great, a man who built one of the largest empires of the ancient world by the age of 30, ate simple food. Despite the glory, the marble busts, and the gilded myths that surround him, he lived and marched with a diet not so different from the average foot soldier, at least for much of his military campaigns. His army, after all, moved quickly. It had to. With over 30,000 infantrymen and thousands more cavalry, siege engineers, doctors, scribes, cooks, slaves, and hangers-on, food wasn't just a necessity, it was a logistical riddle. The Macedonians couldn't carry enough supplies for months on end, so they foraged, requisitioned, or bought food along the way. This meant relying heavily on the landscape, the harvests of subdued territories, and whatever animals or grains were available. So what did Alexander eat? Let's begin with the base of his diet: bread, or more accurately, barley cakes, dense, coarse, and packed with calories. The Macedonians, like many ancient armies, lived on barley far more than wheat. Barley was easier to grow, more resilient in poor soils, and could be stored longer. The grain would be crushed and mixed with water, perhaps a pinch of salt or oil, if lucky, and then baked on heated stones or coals. This wasn't the fluffy bread of modern bakeries, but something hard, brownish gray, and often flavored faintly of ash or the previous night's goat stew. Alongside this, the army consumed pulses, mainly lentils and chickpeas when available. Dried legumes were ideal for marching, lightweight, durable, and filling. They would be boiled over crude fires, seasoned with whatever herbs or oils could be scavenged. But meat? Yes, occasionally. The army sometimes drove livestock along with them, goats, sheep, even a few cattle. On rare days of feasting or after successful raids, these animals were slaughtered. Most often it was goat or sheep. It would be boiled, not roasted, since boiling stretched the meat further and preserved more fat and nutrients in the broth. Alexander himself, though a king, did not gorge on luxury during campaigns. Plutarch wrote of his temperance, how he would eat sparingly and drink less than most of his officers. His court had a cook, of course, and sometimes he indulged in the delicacies presented by newly conquered territories: dried dates, honeyed figs, or spiced meats. But during the long marches, he ate alongside his men. Wine diluted with water was common. Water alone was often dangerous. Contaminated streams or shallow wells could spread disease quickly. Mixing wine helped disinfect it and added some flavor. Wine was stored in goatskin bladders or clay amphorae, sloshing and fermenting further as the army moved. And there were peculiarities, too. Alexander developed a taste for Persian cucumbers, reportedly long and sweet, and was known to consume a bit of garlic daily for its supposed medicinal properties. As the army moved into Egypt and Persia, the food changed. The new territories offered not just exotic spices, but different grains, fruits, and cooking methods. In Babylon, the soldiers tasted dates, pomegranates, and fish from the Euphrates. Local cooks introduced flatbreads, often topped with oils and herbs unfamiliar to the Macedonian palate. Occasionally, court records mention pistachios, sesame cakes, and even pickled vegetables, preserved for long marches through arid lands. Still, for every night in a Persian palace, there were months on dusty roads. And during those times, the army leaned heavily on dried provisions: salted meats, dried apricots or raisins, and most critically, grain rations. A soldier might carry a small sack of barley and use a simple hand mill to grind it daily. Fires were started using flint, dung, or whatever kindling could be found. Cooks worked in rotations. There were no dedicated kitchen brigades. Each man was expected to handle his own portion unless injured or high-ranking. But here's the thing. The daily food grind wasn't just survival, it was strategy. You see, Alexander's ability to keep his army supplied was a key to his victories. He studied Persian logistical systems, adopted local supply chain models, and relied on a network of river barges, pack animals, and local tribute. In cities like Tyre and Persepolis, grain stores were seized not just for the moment, but for future marches. Supply depots were set up weeks in advance. Rations were calculated meticulously, and yet hunger was never far. In the Gedrosian Desert, during a notorious return march from India, thousands of Alexander's troops perished, not from battle, but from thirst, heatstroke, and starvation. Water was so scarce that soldiers reportedly slaughtered pack animals just for the liquid in their intestines. In such moments, the memory of simpler barley cakes must have seemed like a banquet. Still, even in hardship, Alexander maintained rituals around food. Meals became moments of control and morale. Sharing food with his men wasn't just practical, it was symbolic. It showed that the great conqueror was not above his own army's bread. And this, in part, preserved loyalty. In the quiet after dinner, by flickering firelight, one could hear Macedonian soldiers mutter about the day's bread, or share bites of dried figs, or curse the bitterness of old goat meat. These moments, so small, carried the army forward. Food, it turns out, was not just fuel, it was cohesion, identity, routine. But there is one more layer worth exploring: Alexander's feasts. Not the battlefield dinners, but the courtly banquets held in conquered capitals. There the food was different, ostentatious, symbolic. You find yourself at a different kind of table now. The fires are larger, the bowls are more ornate, and the men sitting nearby wear silks instead of bronze. The plates are not simple wood or clay, but occasionally even metal, silver, perhaps even gold if the region is wealthy. The year is now closer to 330 BCE. Alexander has moved far east, into Persia and beyond, and the food has changed as much as the politics. In this second act of his campaign, Alexander's meals became less about sustenance and more about statecraft. The court banquet, an ancient tradition among the Persians and earlier Mesopotamians, was something Alexander quickly adopted, not just out of luxury, but to integrate himself into the cultures he had conquered. The feast was no longer merely a place to eat, it became a stage. The Persian royal banquet was a well-structured affair. Under Darius III and the Achaemenid kings before him, it involved ritual seating, serving, and specific foods meant to reflect order, prosperity, and divine favor. When Alexander conquered Persepolis and took over Babylon, he inherited not just a palace, but a culinary and political system built on opulence and routine. At these feasts, guests were arranged by status and ethnicity. Persians sat nearest the center. Greeks were often placed at a respectful but lower level, especially in the early months after conquest. Wine flowed freely, mixed with water, as was common, and servers moved with deliberate choreography. Dishes were presented in courses, sometimes with symbolic meaning. Alexander, unlike most Macedonians before him, embraced this spectacle. He began to appear in Persian dress, much to the discomfort of his Macedonian officers. He introduced elements of proskynesis, the Persian courtly gesture of bowing or kneeling, again causing resentment among his inner circle. But the meals themselves? Those could be used to soften such shifts. Consider the banquet he held after marrying Roxana, the daughter of a Bactrian nobleman. The marriage was a political alliance, but the feast was the real statement. It was reportedly lavish. Local meats and stews, bread soaked in pomegranate syrup, pistachio desserts, and abundant wine. For many guests, it was their first time dining beside Greeks or Persians, without a sword between them. Alexander's chefs had to adapt. A Macedonian military cook might have known how to boil goat or grind barley, but court cooks now prepared braised lamb with coriander, spiced rice, or even fish stews flavored with tamarind and saffron. Alexander developed a taste for Persian dates stuffed with nuts, for sour yogurt sauces, and even fermented milk drinks. It wasn't just indulgence. It was assimilation. Food was a form of governance. by partaking in and hosting multicultural banquets. Alexander signaled to his new subjects, "I am one of you," and to his old comrades, "This is the new world we live in." He went so far as to adopt certain Zoroastrian culinary rituals, avoiding specific meats or fasting on some occasions, not out of religious belief but political strategy. Still, the shift wasn't easy. Tensions simmered. At one famous banquet in Bactria, Alexander tried to unite his Macedonian officers with Persian nobles by having them eat and drink together. This was not standard practice. In both cultures, mealtime could reflect strict hierarchies. Drinking from the same cup or sharing a platter signaled trust or even equality. The event was carefully choreographed with toasts, prayers, and a shared sacrificial offering, but not everyone appreciated this blending. Alexander's longtime friend and general, Clitus the Black, eventually lashed out in anger, at a banquet, no less over what he saw as the erosion of Macedonian values. Drunkenness, frustration, and perhaps the weight of years of campaigning boiled over. In a tragic and deeply symbolic act, Alexander killed Clitus with a spear during that argument. A man who had saved his life at the Battle of Granicus died over a disagreement that began at dinner. It's telling, isn't it, that amidst the grandeur of empire building, a shared meal could lead to both unity and catastrophe. Food, which had once been a shared hardship on the road to India, had become a flashpoint for cultural identity. In other banquets, things went better. After the conquest of Susa, Alexander hosted what is now called the Susa Weddings, a massive political feast where he married Persian princesses and encouraged dozens of his men to do the same. The food list was staggering. Over 10,000 sheep, 4,000 cows, 6,000 fowl, and hundreds of amphorae of wine and beer. It lasted for days. But even here, the banquet was layered with meaning. It wasn't about gluttony, it was about policy. Through marriage and mealtime, Alexander was forging a new aristocracy, a hybrid elite who had eaten the same foods, shared toasts under the same tent, and broken bread across once bloody borders. Yet not all Macedonians agreed with this approach. Many resented being expected to dress in silk or adopt Persian table manners. They missed the fire-cooked goat, the bitter wine, the simple barley cakes eaten under stars without protocol. Food nostalgia is real, even in empires. And it brings us to a quieter, more personal question. What did Alexander himself want from these meals? Was it comfort, power, legacy? He was a man of enormous ambition, but he also carried a copy of the Iliad under his pillow. He idolized Achilles, who also feasted with comrades between battles. Perhaps in some way these banquets were Alexander's attempt to become not just a king but a myth, a figure who united East and West, sword and spoon, battlefield and banquet hall. Still, for all the glory, the empire was fraying. Many of the Persian nobles felt alienated. Many Greeks resented the dilution of their traditions. Alexander's physical health, too, was deteriorating. Whether from wounds, stress, or overindulgence, no one is certain. Banquets became heavier, both in tone and substance. And then came Babylon. In 323 BCE, Alexander held his final great banquet. There. It was vast. Thousands of soldiers, nobles, priests, and scribes attended. It was a celebration of his next campaign, his plan to conquer Arabia and possibly beyond. The food flowed. So did the wine. But not long after, Alexander fell ill. Some blamed the food. Others said it was the wine, or perhaps poison, or malaria. He never recovered. And so, the man who ate barley with his soldiers and Persian sweets with his nobles died in a city full of provisions. In a palace surrounded by overflowing storerooms and silent amphorae, the great conqueror closed his eyes. But before that final illness, he had planned something unusual, a voyage down the Euphrates to observe the farms and food systems of Babylonia. He wanted to understand the irrigation, the grain storage, and the bread-making processes of Mesopotamia. Why? What did Alexander see in the humble business of agriculture? It is early morning in Babylon, and the sun casts a dull orange light over the canals and tilled fields surrounding the city. The Euphrates moved slowly beside a maze of levees and irrigation ditches, an ancient system built long before the Greeks, or even the Persians, had dreamed of conquest. The scene is far removed from the clang of swords or the speeches of kings, but for Alexander the Great, this is precisely where his mind had begun to settle in his final months. It may seem anticlimactic, perhaps even strange, that the man who crossed deserts and defeated empires would become fascinated by grain production. Yet by 323 BCE, Alexander was no longer just a conqueror. He was an administrator, a lawgiver, and above all, a man trying to feed an empire. His proposed journey along the Euphrates was not one of glory. It was to be a practical inspection, a tour of the agricultural backbone of his new eastern territories. Babylon, Susa, and the entire Mesopotamian region had been feeding cities since the dawn of recorded time. These lands were older than Alexander's own lineage, and he knew, if he could control the breadbasket, he could secure the empire. For centuries, Babylonian farmers had maintained sophisticated irrigation systems, often administered by temple bureaucracies. Grain, especially emmer wheat and barley, was collected, taxed, stored, and redistributed through vast granaries, many of which were state-owned. Alexander did not intend to abolish this system. Instead, he wanted to study and adapt it. Here, food was not just sustenance or celebration. It was currency. It was power. You see, in Babylon, a worker's wage might be paid in barley. A priest might be allotted wine, oil, and grain measured in shekels. Soldiers, even under Alexander, received rations in kind when coinage was scarce. In such an economy, the control of agricultural logistics was as critical as the control of armies. Alexander's scribes began gathering data: the average yield of barley per acre, the reliability of irrigation canals, the number of oxen required to plow royal fields. Surveyors mapped the flood zones, officials inspected silos. These efforts were not glamorous, but they were empire-defining. One of Alexander's lesser-known innovations was the standardization of storage measurements across his territories. Previously, each region had its own grain unit: the Babylonian gur, the Egyptian hekat, the Greek medimnos. Under Alexander's unification efforts, scribes began working on conversion charts, allowing more consistent taxation and rationing. It's tedious work: columns of numbers, inventories of oil jars, detailed maps of granary distribution points, but it formed the hidden architecture of a world power. An army marches on its stomach, as the saying goes, but a kingdom survives on its ledgers. And it wasn't just grain. Salt, used for both preservation and trade, became a strategic resource. In regions like Arachosia or Carmania, Alexander appointed officials specifically to oversee salt routes and levy controlled taxes on their use. Salted fish from the Persian Gulf, dried meats from the Zagros Mountains, and pickled vegetables from India began to appear more regularly in supply trains. Even as the great conqueror dreamed of new campaigns, into Arabia, perhaps even westward, toward Carthage, his mind returned to these basics: food, water, and storage. He also showed growing interest in settling his veterans into agricultural colonies. Several new cities, some called Alexandria, were laid out near fertile lands, complete with farm allotments for retired soldiers. It was a clever plan. A garrison that could grow its own food was less dependent on distant supply lines, and veterans who became landowners were more likely to remain loyal. These quiet agricultural colonies never made it into grand historical epics, but they mattered. They provided stability and ensured that his sprawling domains would not collapse under hunger or mismanagement. Yet Alexander's attention to food systems also had a cultural motive. He wanted to foster a hybrid agricultural knowledge base. Greek plow techniques met Persian irrigation. Indian spice preservation merged with Mesopotamian salting methods. In a way, Alexander was building a culinary and agricultural fusion empire, though it never had time to mature. As his health began to fail in Babylon, possibly due to fever, stress, or even poisoning, Alexander gave one final command: an expedition to explore the coastlines of Arabia, not just for conquest, but to understand the region's climate, water resources, and agricultural potential. This wasn't ambition without vision. Alexander seemed to understand what so many later emperors forgot. Swords may win battles, but empires are kept by bread. His death halted these plans. The generals squabbled. The empire fractured. Some of the grain policies remained, some didn't. But his interest in agriculture, his recognition of the mundane as essential, offers a quieter view of a man often painted in extremes. In the end, there is something almost humble about Alexander's final fascinations. For all the glory of his victories, he knew what truly sustained an empire. The farmer with his plow, the cook with her barley cakes, the clerk with a grain ledger, and so, the great conqueror, who once shared bread with soldiers, under stars and then feasted with kings on gilded platters, began his final days planning how to grow, store, and distribute food. A man who could have anything, dreaming of granaries. Perhaps that is the most profound part of his legacy. Not the battles, not the statues, but the realization that no matter how far you march, you must always eat. And so we end, not in war, but in a field. Not with a sword, but with a scythe. But a question remains. What if Alexander had lived just a few more years? Would he have become less a warrior and more a farmer king? A master of empire not by conquest but by cultivation? The postal routes of the Persian Empire, how horses changed the world. Slowly you are standing at the edge of a dusty road in what is now western Iran. The year is somewhere between 500 and 450 BCE, during the reign of Darius I and the third king of the Achaemenid Empire. The road stretches in both directions farther than the eye can follow, but it is not empty. You hear hoofbeats, steady, rhythmic, determined. A courier is coming fast. He does not stop. He barely slows. His horse is lean and exhausted. A stable hand steps forward from a nearby post station, grabs the reins, and the courier leaps down. Another man is already waiting beside a fresh horse. Within moments, the satchel of documents is transferred. The second courier mounts and rides off again, eastward toward Persepolis or maybe Susa, his sandals slapping the stirrups. What you are watching is the Chaparkhane, the Persian royal postal system in motion. Centuries before Rome would perfect its roads, before the Mongols would establish their Yam courier system, the Achaemenid Empire was already bound together by one of the most advanced communication networks in the ancient world. This wasn't a postal service as we know it today. There were no birthday cards or holiday packages. But it was the beating artery of imperial administration. The Royal Road, as Herodotus would later call it, stretched over 1,500 miles from Sardis in western Anatolia, modern-day Turkey, to Susa, one of the empire's capitals in Elam. With relay stations spaced every 15 to 20 miles, couriers could cross the entire length in 7 to 9 days, a staggering speed for the ancient world. The empire itself was vast, stretching from the Indus River to the Aegean Sea, encompassing dozens of languages, customs, climates, and topographies. To govern such a sprawl required not only armies and satraps, governors, but information. Orders, reports, tax records, intelligence, all of it had to move, and it had to move quickly. That was the genius of the postal route. Horses and humans, moving in shifts, like links in a living chain. The man you just saw wasn't traveling the whole empire. He would ride one leg, perhaps 20 miles, hand off the satchel, rest, and repeat. Horses were stabled at each station, well-fed and trained for speed and endurance. The couriers themselves were not ordinary riders. They were members of a specialized class, royal messengers known for discipline and loyalty. Their role was sacred. Herodotus even praised them in his histories, writing, "Neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness of night prevents these couriers from completing their appointed course with all speed." Yes, that's where the modern U.S. Postal Service motto comes from. But the system wasn't just about fast travel. It was about precision and predictability. Each post station, known as a pyridazis, was responsible for maintaining horses, food, water, and shelter for couriers. These were not grand structures, often simple outposts built of mud brick or stone, but they were lifelines. Some even had fire beacons for signaling emergencies across long distances. And the messages? Most were administrative. Written in Aramaic, the empire's lingua franca, they might contain tax instructions, troop movements, grain quotas, or orders from the king. Sealed with clay and stamped with a cylinder seal, they traveled tucked in satchels, sometimes waxed to repel rain, sometimes bound in leather. The process was carefully tracked. Some postmasters kept records noting when a courier arrived, how long he stayed, and whether the next horse was ready. In some places, scrolls were copied at relay points, ensuring redundancy in case of theft or destruction. This all sounds like machinery, but imagine the human element. A courier riding through cold rain in Cappadocia. Another climbing mountain passes in Armenia. Another baking under the sun in the deserts near Persepolis. They had no applause, no celebration, just the quiet satisfaction of speed, the knowledge that the empire ticked forward because of their hooves. But let's step back a moment. Why invest so much in a postal system? Because communication is control. Darius the Fur, like all great administrators, understood that conquest alone is not enough. You must maintain. After securing the throne, partly through military force and partly through cunning, he focused on governance. That meant roads, and roads meant mail. The royal road itself followed older trade routes, many of them dating back to Assyrian or Elamite times. Darius improved and expanded them. Inscriptions found at Nakshi Rustam and Persepolis mention his building efforts, not temples, not monuments, but roads and channels. In a quiet sense, Darius believed in logistics. His greatness lay not in flamboyance, but in systemization. The postal network was part of his larger strategy of bureaucratic empire, standard weights and measures, coinage reforms, census-taking, and satrap-led taxation, and the roads were not, only for government use. Merchants benefited. So did artisans, priests, and travelers. Though common people couldn't use the express courier service, they often followed the same roads and stopped at the same stations. Over time, towns grew up along the routes. Taverns, markets, even temples catered to travelers moving between cities. In a way, these postal routes became the empire's circulatory system. Not glamorous, not dramatic, but absolutely vital. Still, there were challenges. Banditry was common in some remote regions. Couriers carried no weapons. They relied on the relative safety of the empire and the deterrence of royal punishment. The roads themselves could be washed out by floods, blocked by snow, or overgrown if neglected. Maintaining them required constant labor and local oversight. But the system endured for over 150 years. When Alexander the Great conquered Persia in 330 BCE, he used the same roads and stations to move his own dispatches. He didn't dismantle the system, he adopted it. That tells you everything you need to know. Horses changed the world slowly, not by charge or cavalry, but by carrying letters across mountains and deserts, from satraps to kings, from grain stores to tax offices. And so here we are again, standing beside the road. Another courier approaches, his satchel bouncing. He's tired but focused. He doesn't know the full message he carries, nor does he need to. He knows his portion of the route, and that's enough. The empire depends on him, quietly, invisibly. But what exactly did those messages say? How did the contents of these waxed satchels steer policy, war, and peace? In the soft glow of an oil lamp, a scribe dips his reed pen into a dish of ink. He's seated on a low stool in a quiet administrative office in Susa, one of the many capitals of the Persian Empire. Before him lies a strip of parchment. Next to it, a clay envelope, soon to be pressed with a royal seal and entrusted to the care of a courier. He is not writing poetry. He is not chronicling great events. He is composing a letter that will instruct a provincial satrap to adjust the grain levy in a northern village by 3%. This is the hidden world of imperial paperwork, the part of empire that few remember, but without which no army could march, no tax could be collected, and no governor could govern. The Persian postal system wasn't only about speed, it was about the diffusion of authority, and it relied on a vast, meticulous system of scribes, records, and standards. These messages came in many forms. Some were written on parchment or papyrus, especially for long-distance lightweight communication. Others were etched into clay, tablets then wrapped in a second layer of clay, the envelope, and sealed with the sender's emblem. If tampered with, the envelope would break. This was, in effect, ancient, tamper-evident technology. What did the letters say? Not declarations of war or epic speeches. Most were deeply practical. Tax instructions, how much barley to collect in which month from which village. Military supply orders, rations for 150 horsemen traveling from Sardis to Ecbatana. Legal rulings, responses to land disputes, debt claims, or criminal appeals. Personnel updates, transfers, promotions, or dismissals of mid-level administrators. Occasionally, a letter bore instructions from the king himself, addressed to a satrap. These were often written in Old Persian cuneiform, a script used only for royal inscriptions and formal declarations. But most communication happened in Imperial Aramaic, the administrative language of the empire. Why Aramaic? It was simple, widespread, and versatile. By adopting it as the lingua franca, the Achaemenid court made it easier to govern a multilingual empire stretching from Egypt to India. Even Greek officials under Persian rule often used Aramaic in official correspondence. In a dusty archive, in Elephantine, Egypt, archaeologists discovered a cache of letters from a Jewish military colony stationed there under Persian command, written in Aramaic. These letters revealed requests for timber, complaints about delayed wages, even appeals to local satraps. One letter pleads for the reconstruction of a destroyed temple, clear evidence that provincial voices could, and did, reach the center. And how were messages prioritized? The Persian courier system included classifications, urgent dispatches, standard orders, sealed letters, or routine accounts. The highest priority messages often bore royal seals and traveled, with escort riders to ensure security. Some were delivered by foot messengers over short distances, particularly in mountainous terrain where horses struggled. Timing mattered. A delay in a letter could lead to over-collection of taxes, starvation in a garrison, or misallocation of troops. And so records were kept at each station: arrival times, departure times, names of riders, condition of horses. This was a living system, self-monitoring, quietly humming behind the scenes of power. The relay stations themselves, chaparkhane, were part lodge, part stable, part outpost. They employed hostlers, cooks, stable hands, and scribes. Some grew their own fodder crops for the horses. Others stocked dried dates, barley cakes, and wine for the couriers. These were not luxurious spaces. A bedroll in the corner, a basin of water, perhaps a brazier in colder climates. And while the roads connected capitals, they also bound the periphery. A village near the eastern frontier might receive orders from Persepolis within a few weeks. The illusion of proximity created by the courier system helped preserve the empire's unity. People living hundreds of miles from the king still felt within the king's reach, but communication, like all things, could fail. Sometimes a letter arrived too late. In 484 BCE, a revolt broke out in Egypt, sparked partly by delayed responses and regional frustrations. Despite the postal network, the distance between the decision-makers in Susa and the rebels in Memphis was still measured in weeks. The empire won back control, but at the cost of lives, treasure, and confidence. Other failures were subtler. A satrap might lose a letter inconvenient to his plans. A scribe might miscopy a figure, turning 4,000 rations into 40,000. Even when letters arrived, their interpretation could vary depending on dialect, education, or the scribe's bias. To combat this, some letters included redundant phrasing, repeating key numbers or directives multiple times. Some were accompanied by oral messengers whose job was to clarify intent, and occasionally, a courier delivered identical copies to multiple recipients, ensuring the message survived in some form. Still, the system mostly worked. It worked well enough to allow governors to administer provinces from hundreds of miles away. It worked well enough to support seasonal tax cycles, military rotations, diplomatic coordination, and even internal propaganda. Consider this. Darius's famous Behistun inscription a multilingual carving on a cliff face in western Iran, was not just a monument. It was a kind of broadcast, an ancient press release. Copies of its content were likely dispatched via couriers across the empire, sent to satraps and temples, translated and read aloud. The postal system made that possible. Even the empire's death traveled by road. When a king died, like Xerxes, assassinated by court intrigue, the news spread by courier, accompanied by sealed edicts ensuring continuity, legitimacy, and suppression of dissent. So much rested on these small, unadorned objects, letters scratched in ink or carved in clay. Not weapons, not monuments, but messages. Thousands of them, carrying the daily heartbeat of a state. And yet, for all its efficiency, the postal system didn't ensure loyalty. Some satraps still rebelled. Some generals still defected. Communication could only do so much. The question is how much of an empire can be reduced to a scroll in a saddlebag. As the courier gallops eastward, his letter slapping against his hip, he doesn't know the wider impact of his journey. He is a gear in a machine, a fast, dusty messenger in a system built for slowness, precision, and reach. But what happens when the system is inherited by another? What did Alexander the Great do with the Persian roads once they were his? The Achaemenid Empire fell in 330 BCE, but the roads did not. When Alexander the Great marched east from Macedonia, cutting through the remnants of Persian power, he didn't destroy the infrastructure that sustained his enemy. Quite the opposite. He embraced it, refined it, and rode upon it literally and figuratively. The same royal road that had once carried tax demands to satraps now bore proclamations of conquest from a Greek general with imperial ambitions of his own. Alexander's forces moved quickly, not only due to military discipline, but because the Persian postal system and road networks still worked. Despite decades of internal unrest and foreign invasion, many of the Chapar Khane stations remained intact. Horses were still stabled, couriers still known, paths still mapped. Alexander, ever pragmatic, saw no reason to replace what already functioned. He repurposed the system for his own empire in the making. From Babylon to Ecbatana, from Persepolis to Susa, his orders traveled on the same dusty roads that had once carried the voices of Darius and Xerxes. In some cases, Alexander even used local administrators trained in the Achaemenid system to govern newly conquered territories. Rather than replace Persian scribes and postal officials wholesale, he often incorporated them into his own bureaucracy, layering Greek titles atop Persian institutions. After all, why reinvent the scroll? This blending of old and new laid the groundwork for the Hellenistic world. Greek and Persian customs coexisted uneasily but productively in cities like Seleucia, Antioch, and Alexandria in Arachosia, modern Kandahar. Communication between these far-flung places relied not just on new Greek colonies, but on the bones of the Persian road network, and the roads kept carrying letters. By the time of the Parthians, 247 BCE, 224 CE, the old royal road had changed hands again. The Parthians controlled much of the old Persian heartland, but with a looser, more decentralized system. Still, the postal tradition lingered. Merchants, soldiers, and governors continued to rely on relay networks, even if the official state system was less uniform than before. Under the Sassanid Empire, 224-651 CE, the postal system was revived more formally. Known as the Piradazishan, it mirrored the old Achaemenid network: riders, relay stations, official seals. Letters were, again, central to governance. In this way, the Persian tradition of long-distance communication persisted through 3 successive dynasties and over 1,000 years. But the most unexpected heir to the Persian roads came not from the east, but the west. When the Romans began expanding their road system in the 3rd century BCE, they were aware of the Persian example. Roman engineers took pride in their innovations, but the concept of a state-run courier system, using relay stations and prioritized routes, was not theirs alone. They too instituted a cursus publicus, a network of roads and stations for official use only. Though Roman roads were more permanent, paved in stone, marked with milestones, the principle was the same: governance through movement. Even the Byzantines and early Islamic caliphates that followed adopted postal strategies shaped, in part, by Persian precedent. The Barid system of the Umayyads and Abbasids, for example, relied on a chain of couriers, with stations often built near old Persian routes. And yet, these innovations rarely earn the spotlight. We praise conquests, battles, monuments. We remember the names of kings and generals, but we forget the men on horseback and the letters they carried. Let's return to them now. A courier leaves Sardis in the early 5th century BCE. He carries a sealed scroll, orders from the king to adjust the year, salt tax in a village 3 weeks ride away. He doesn't know the villagers. He doesn't know the king. He knows only the route, the sequence of stations, the names of stable hands, the shape of the hills he must cross. He'll ride 30 miles that day. His horse will drink water drawn from a clay cistern. He will eat barley cake, perhaps a handful of dates, then sleep on a mat before rising again. His journey will be unrecorded. His name will be lost. But his message will arrive. It is easy to underestimate the impact of such systems. There is no glory in the dust of a hoofprint. But in a world where distance usually meant disconnection, the Persian courier system stitched together cultures, cities, and economies. It reduced isolation, enabled planning, ensured order. It made the abstract idea of empire tangible, and it endured. When we speak of legacy, we often point to art, philosophy, or architecture. But perhaps the truest legacy of the Persian Empire is something quieter: the belief that information can and should move fast across great distances, and that systems must be built to serve that belief. In that sense, every time you check your mail, send an email, or await a parcel, you are echoing a system more than 2.5 millennia old. You are, in a small way, participating in the long continuation of a dusty road first trod by Persian horses and their silent riders. Not with trumpets, not with banners, but with letters and discipline. The road, after all, outlived the kings. Beer, bread, and onions, the true fuel of the Pyramid Age. You're standing in the shadow of the Great Pyramid of Giza, its sides catching the light of an early desert sun. But you are not a pharaoh, not a priest, not even a stonecutter. You're a baker. Your job today, like yesterday and the day before, is to grind flour, mix it with water, shape it, and set it near a fire to bake. You will do this again tomorrow. You will do it 500 more times this year, and you are not alone. Somewhere between 10,000 and 30,000 laborers worked on the pyramid sites during Egypt's Old Kingdom, particularly during the reign of Khufu, c. on 2589-2566 BCE. They didn't live in slave pens, contrary to long-standing myths. They lived in organized, temporary worker villages, complete with bakeries, breweries, dormitories, and infirmaries. This was not slavery. It was state-organized labor, often rotating seasonally, with farmers contributing work during the Nile's annual flood when fields were underwater and crops could not be planted. So, how do you feed tens of thousands of workers in the desert? You start with grain, tons of it. Egypt's economy was built on wheat and barley, harvested in the fertile black soil of the Nile Valley. Most laborers received a daily ration of bread and beer, a pairing that was not only nourishing but calorie-dense, hydrating, and culturally essential. Bread was often coarse and dark, made from emmer wheat, which had to be painstakingly dehusked before grinding. The resulting flour contained sand, grit, and the occasional pebble, contributing to the worn-down teeth of many mummified workers. Bread production was labor-intensive. First, grain was soaked and pounded. Then it was ground using large quernstones by teams of women or junior laborers. The flour was mixed into dough, allowed to rise, and then baked in dome-shaped clay ovens, many of which still stand in the ruins of the Giza worker village. Alongside bread came beer, but not the bubbly drink you might imagine. Egyptian beer was more of a fermented gruel, thick, slightly sweet, low in alcohol, and rich in nutrients. It was brewed by soaking partially, baked loaves of bread in water and allowing them to ferment. Workers likely consumed several liters per day, not as a luxury but as a necessity. Safe hydration in a world where clean water was unreliable. But the pyramid workers didn't live on bread and beer alone. Records from the Giza Plateau and the nearby settlement known as Hayt el Gharab show that workers were also provided with meat, fish, legumes, onions, and garlic. Excavated bones reveal that cattle, sheep, and goats were slaughtered regularly. Estimates suggest hundreds of cattle per year were consumed just to feed the labor force. Fish from the Nile supplemented protein intake, while beans and lentils added fiber and variety, and onions, so many onions, enough that they appear frequently in worker records, ration lists, and even petitions. Onions and garlic were believed to promote health and ward off disease. Laborers prized them. One ancient record even suggests that a delay in garlic delivery sparked worker unrest. Daily rations were carefully tracked. On a fragment of limestone, what modern archaeologists call an ostrakhan, a scribe might note, for 12 workers, 12 loaves, 24 jars beer, 6 onions, 1 goat, for slaughter. This kind of record wasn't rare. Egyptian bureaucracy was remarkably meticulous. Ration lists, attendance rolls, delivery logs. These were essential to managing laborers across multiple pyramid construction phases. A well-fed workforce was a productive workforce, and the pharaoh's grand ambition depended entirely on the stomachs of his workers. Even housing was structured. The worker village at Giza had modular dormitories, streets, latrines, storage silos, and water channels. It could be assembled and dismantled based on the season or project needs. Stoneworkers, carpenters, and masons had higher status quarters. More laborious jobs earned more beer. Scribes and foremen had private rooms and additional food rations. In Isatindide, a way the pyramid project functioned like a small city-state, hierarchical, planned, and sustained by calories. Sickness was inevitable, and the ancient Egyptians anticipated it. Archaeological remains show signs of medical treatment. Broken bones set and healed, abscessed teeth removed, spinal injuries treated with support bindings. A few makeshift infirmaries have been identified near the workers' village. This wasn't compassion. It was economics. A dead worker was a wasted resource. A healed one could return to grinding flour, hauling stone, or firing bricks. And then, of course, there were the administrators, the scribes and overseers. They didn't haul stone. They sat under shaded canopies with reed pens and pots of ink, recording the movement of goods, grain in, bread out, beer made, beer delivered, goats slaughtered, hides tallied. Their work may seem dull, but without it, the pyramid would never have risen. So much depends on these small acts: the turning of a grindstone, the fermentation of a barley mash, the sharp smell of onions being sliced in a stone bowl. While kings carved their names into granite, ordinary men built tombs with their stomachs full of beer and their hands coated in flour. It was dusty, monotonous, and utterly essential. And yet, for all the scribes' efforts, we still don't know everything. How were food deliveries scheduled so precisely? What happened when a shipment spoiled, or when the Nile's flood brought fewer fish than expected? What role did women play in this economy of bread and bureaucracy? And, perhaps most curious of all, why would so many choose to spend months in the desert baking bricks and slicing onions for a tomb they would never enter? The pyramid may rise silently, block by block, but the system that feeds it is anything but silent. Behind every basket of grain, every jar of beer, and every slaughtered ox is a record, a name, a tally, a symbol on a palm-sized tablet. In the dry air of ancient Egypt, even bureaucracy leaves its bones behind. The most enduring miracle of the pyramids is not just their height or weight. It is the continuity of their construction over years, sometimes decades, without collapse, in planning or supply. These were projects that stretched beyond the lifespan of most workers. In an age without engines, cranes, or fossil fuels, the real power came not from muscle alone, but from logistics, a careful symphony of food, labor, and time. Let us follow a shipment, not a stone. Imagine a granary in the Nile Delta. The harvest has just been collected and stored in massive clay silos. A scribe stands nearby, stylus in hand, noting how much grain is being dispatched. 3 hecate of barley for each of 60 men, he writes, scratching symbols into a linen-bound papyrus. Roll. The grain is loaded onto reed boats bound for Giza, poled slowly upriver by boatmen with sun-darkened arms and wide belts of rope. Once ashore, the grain is transferred into another granary, this time in the shadow of the worker village. There, another scribe takes over. He is part of a larger bureaucratic chain, a network of accounting that stretches from the floodplains of Middle Egypt to the offices of temple administrators and royal officials in Memphis. He does not farm, bake, or haul stones, but he knows who does, and he knows what they need. There are rations to distribute. At the start of each work cycle, laborers are assigned to crews, groups known as zebus, with names like the Friends of Khufu or the Drunkards of Menkora. Each crew is assigned a section of the worksite and a designated quarter in the labor village. Each crew also gets a food ledger. This ledger isn't a casual list, it's a rolling schedule. Day by day, week by week, tracking flour, beer, onions, garlic, and meat. It's part of what some Egyptologists call the bureaucratic miracle, a written system so detailed it could schedule grain grinding and beer fermentation down to the day. This is how it worked. Day 1. Soak and pound grain. Day 2. Grind and store. Flour. Day 3. Mix dough, prepare loaves. Day 4. Bake bread, distribute to crew. Repeat. Meanwhile, beer brewers, often women, follow a parallel schedule. Barley is soaked and partially baked into a mash, mixed with warm water and left in jars to ferment. Workers receive jars based on status and workload. Stone haulers get more. Supervisors get better jars, often marked with small clay seals denoting quality. And while this seems like simple food distribution, it's more than that. This system had layers of control and accountability. Scribes were rotated between sites to avoid corruption. Regular audits were conducted. Temple officials occasionally sent inspectors to ensure accurate weights and measurements. In some records, scribes were punished for loss of rations, a bureaucratic way of saying they stole food. Behind the dusty simplicity of bread and onions was a machine of clay and ink, but it wasn't all numbers. Religion seeped into every corner. Before meals were distributed, small portions were offered to the gods. Tiny loaves set on altars, beer spilled on the earth. Work on the pyramids may have been political and practical, but it was also ritual. The laborers believed their work sustained the pharaoh in life and death, and the pharaoh in turn was responsible for keeping the Nile flooding and the food coming. If the grain stopped flowing, it wasn't just a logistical failure, it was a cosmic one. There are glimpses of stress in the record. Some seasons grain shipments were delayed, likely due to poor harvests or Nile irregularities. When this happened, the scribes switched to emergency rations, lower quality bread made from older stores, thinner beer, and reductions in meat distribution. Notes from the time suggest that labor crews were reassigned or sent home early during particularly lean months. Despite this, the pyramid construction continued. It may have slowed, but it rarely stopped entirely. This was due to the clever scheduling of labor. Workers weren't conscripted year-round. They arrived in rotations, particularly during the inundation months when their own farms were submerged by the Nile. This allowed for a seasonal labor force that replenished itself naturally, without complete reliance on one set of hands. It also built community. Some records show workers returning year after year, forming long-term crews. Graffiti on pyramid walls names groups of men, friends who carved their names into stone with pride, not resentment. This wasn't slavery. It was obligation, yes, but it was also identity. And food reinforced that identity. A well-fed crew could outperform others. Internal competitions were encouraged. A crew that hauled more blocks received extra rations, an incentive system centuries ahead of its time. Bread was not just sustenance, it was a reward, a marker of status, and a signal of order. Over time, the system evolved. Later dynasties inherited the logistics, scaled them, repurposed them. By the Middle Kingdom, Similar food distribution systems were used in temple construction and canal projects. The concept of state-supported labor tied to seasonal cycles and food-based compensation became a hallmark of ancient Egyptian administration, the bureaucracy of bread-shaped Egypt just as surely as the Nile. And yet, for all the structure and organization, many questions linger. What happened when two crews demanded the same rations? How were disputes over bread or beer resolved in the absence of courts? Did some scribes deliberately undercount supplies to pocket excess grain? And perhaps most fascinating of all, if food was the true currency of labor, what did the laborers dream of when their bellies were full and the stars hung silent above the half-finished pyramid? Even the greatest meals are eventually forgotten. The bread is eaten, the beer jar emptied, the bones tossed in the dust. So it was with the pyramid workers. Their labor built eternity, but their own stories slowly fell into silence. What happened? After the last stone was placed atop the Great Pyramid? After the final work crew packed up their baskets and returned to the Nile Valley, what remained? We begin in Hayt el Ghurab, the workers' village at Giza. Today, it is little more than an archaeological patch. Low walls, ash pits, broken clay ovens, and thousands upon thousands of discarded bones. But beneath this seeming monotony lies one of the most advanced logistical hubs of the ancient world. Here, the feeding of a labor force wasn't a single act, but a sustained performance over decades. The ruins suggest that the village was not a simple camp, but a planned, organized institution, a prototype for state-controlled infrastructure. Dormitories with precise measurements, granaries arranged for easy distribution, bread ovens clustered to reduce wood consumption and manage airflow. Even the latrines were placed in patterns, suggesting a conscious effort to prevent disease. It was, in every sense, a functioning supply city. And what of the dead? In the shadow of the Great Pyramid lie several small cemeteries. These are not royal tombs. They are simple shaft graves, dug in the rocky desert, each containing a single body. Yet the workers buried here were not forgotten. Their graves include offerings, small clay jars, amulets, even a few tools, and some bear inscriptions. One stela reads, Inspector of the Tomb, Nefer-Hetep, who was true of voice. Another, He who made the granaries flourish, beloved of Khufu. These are not slaves. These are honored laborers given names and space, in eternity by a state that depended on them. Their bones tell quiet tales, worn knees, healed fractures, arthritis in the spine. They lived hard, physical lives, but not abandoned ones. Strikingly, the bones of cattle and sheep found nearby suggest that the meat was of high quality. These weren't leftover scraps. They were regular rations, hints that even ordinary laborers ate better than many in later centuries. Perhaps it was part of the deal. Your body for the pharaoh's monument, and in return, daily bread, warm beer, a shared fire, and a place in the afterlife. But what became of the system itself? Egypt's pyramid age faded after the 6th dynasty, around 2200 BCE, amid climate shifts and political fragmentation. As centralized power waned, so did the grand construction projects. The bureaucratic food systems, so finely tuned for pyramid building, were repurposed. Grain distributions were redirected to temples. Labor pools shifted from monuments to irrigation and local public works. The once mighty supply lines of Hayt el Ghurab vanished beneath wind and sand. Without a central project to anchor them, the administrative records disappeared. The people returned to their fields, and the pyramid workers became anonymous once more. Yet echoes of their system remained. In later dynasties, particularly during the New Kingdom, pharaohs revived elements of these early logistics. Temples began maintaining their own food records, rationing supplies to priests and workers in much the same way. The model had proven resilient. Food as compensation, records as control, rotation as stability. Even today, traces of the old system linger in Egyptian village life. Communal baking, seasonal labor tied to the Nile, the rhythm of grain and fire so ancient it feels eternal. Archaeologists continue to uncover new fragments, more ostraca, more bones, more bread molds. Each one adds a grain to the picture, but the whole remains. Elusive. We still do not know the names of the women who kneaded dough in the pre-dawn dark. We cannot trace every loaf or every ration. History, like flour, drifts away in the wind. Still, the lesson endures. The pyramids were not built on the backs of slaves, nor conjured by magic. They rose because of 1,000 small acts, of grinding, mixing, pouring, and writing. They rose on calculations and casseroles, on hope and hierarchy, on the quiet dignity of those who showed up every day to bake bread in the heat. It is easy to forget them. That is the nature of history, but if you listen closely, you may hear the rhythm of their lives, the grindstone turning, the beer bubbling, the soft slap of dough in a woman's hands, and you might wonder, what will remain of your work when the dust settles? Salted cod and siege bread. Surviving the siege of Leningrad, you are in Leningrad. The year is 1941. The air is already cold by September, and the sky carries the pale gray tone of an early Russian autumn. But the true winter has not yet begun. What has begun, quietly at first, is the longest siege in modern history. For 872 days, from September 8, 1941 to January 27, 1944, the city of Leningrad, now St. Petersburg, would be surrounded, starved, bombed and frozen by the German army. Cut off from supply routes, ringed by artillery, and frozen in by the harsh Russian winter, the city's defenders and citizens would rely not only on courage, but on bread, bureaucracy, and astonishing ingenuity to survive. This is not a story of tanks or generals. It is a story of ration cards, pea flour, and the bitter calculus of nutrition. At the beginning of the siege, Leningrad was home to over 2.5 million civilians, including 400,000 children. Most had not evacuated before the encirclement began. The roads out had closed, and the railways were cut. The Germans believed the city would fall within weeks from starvation alone. What they did not count on was a deeply entrenched system of urban food logistics, forged during the Soviet era, rigid, often harsh, but surprisingly robust. In the early days of the siege, Leningrad still had stockpiled supplies, enough flour, grains, and canned goods for a few months. But the first major problem was storage. On September 8th, the same day the German army completed the encirclement, a Luftwaffe bombing raid struck the Badaev warehouses, which contained a significant portion of the city's food reserves. The warehouses burned for 2 full days. The flames consumed 3,000 tons of flour and 2,500 tons of sugar. The city lost weeks' worth of food in a single strike. Immediately, rationing tightened. On September 12th, the bread ration was cut to 500 grams per day for workers and 300 grams for others. Within a month, these numbers would fall again. By November 1941, workers received just 250 grams, and children, the elderly, and the unemployed got only 125 grams of bread per day. But this was not bread as you know it. The Leningrad siege bread was made of whatever could be spared. The loaves were black, dense, and bitter. The ingredients changed depending on availability. Some included 50% sawdust flour, cellulose, moldy grains, or seed husks. Occasionally, industrial lubricants or cottonseed cake were added to stretch the recipe. This was caloric bread, not culinary. Its purpose was singular: survival. By November, that meager 125-gram ration contained less than 500 calories, about the energy needed for a short walk, not a full day of living in 30-degree C weather. People began collapsing in the streets from exhaustion, and yet they lined up, wrapped in rags, pulling sleds through snow, to receive their daily bread. Behind every loaf was a paper trail, the Soviet ration system, brutal but methodical, classified citizens into categories: workers, children, dependents, military personnel, factory specialists. Each group had its own quota. Ration cards were printed and distributed through local committees who checked IDs and recorded names daily. Forgery was rampant. People sold counterfeit ration cards on the black market. Some people turned in relatives' death certificates slowly, claiming their rations for a few more days. Theft from bakery lines was common. Police were posted to protect the bread queues, and still it was not enough. To make up for the shortages, the city's scientists and nutritionists searched for alternatives. They made oil from pine needles, hoping for vitamin C. They created a protein paste from fish scales and bones, filtered through industrial machines. They even developed a form of yeast from paper pulp. The Institute of Nutrition issued daily guidance, publishing charts on how many grams of boiled leather yielded how many calories. There were documented recipes for gelatin soup made from wallpaper, paste which still contained traces of starch. As the months dragged on, the winter descended fully. Houses lacked heat. Water mains froze. Corpses began to appear on staircases, in alleys, on benches in the parks. In the darkest months, December 1941 to February 1942, over 100,000 people died each month, mostly from starvation. The Leningrad blockade diary of Tanya Savicheva, a 12-year-old girl, became famous after the war. In it, she wrote, "Zhenya died on December 28, 1941, at 12 noon. Grandma died on January 25, 1942, at 3 o'clock. Leka died on March 17, 1942, at 5 o'clock in the morning. All died. Only Tanya is left." Tanya would die of intestinal tuberculosis the following year, a delayed result of starvation. But not all died. In fact, most survived. How? The answer is in roots, resilience, and a lake of ice. In December 1941, the frozen Lake Ladoga became the city's lifeline. Trucks began to cross the ice by night, headlights off, bringing in sacks of flour, sugar, and dried fish. This desperate supply route, known as the Road of Life, saved the city. Even then, the quantities were small. A single convoy might bring just 80 tons of flour, barely enough for one day's rations. Drivers risked their lives every trip. Many sank through the ice, and yet, the bread never stopped. There is something quietly astonishing in that fact. Day after day, throughout the worst winter, with no fuel, no warmth, and no fresh ingredients, the bakeries of Leningrad continued to operate. Workers, many themselves starving, reported each morning, lit the fires, mixed the flour substitute, and turned out the loaves. Some collapsed while working. Others were buried with their aprons still on. Their names are not famous, but they may have saved more lives than any general. In the silence of that frozen city, as hunger hollowed out the air, there was still the smell of baking, bitter, chemical, dark, but still baking. And so we must ask, what is the true weight of a loaf of bread when each crumb is counted against time itself? The bitter taste of the siege bread lingers long after the last crumb is swallowed. But in Leningrad, survival was never just about what the state rationed. It was also about what could be bartered, stolen, hunted, or simply found. By late 1941, the official rations were no longer sufficient to keep most alive. The grim arithmetic of calories versus cold forced many into desperate measures. The city that was once a vibrant hub of Soviet industry and culture had become a landscape of shadows, scraps, and silent bargains. The official ration card was the key to the bakeries. Without it, you had no bread. But the card did not guarantee life. Behind closed doors, in back alleys and basements, a hidden economy bloomed. It was called the black market. But this term barely captures the scale and complexity of what happened. Neighbors exchanged what little they had. A crust of bread for a handful of potatoes, a pair of shoes for a tin of salted cod. Smugglers risked capture by the NKVD to ferry goods across the ice or through German lines. Some sold ration cards themselves, a currency more precious than gold. Survival also meant looking beyond the city's walls. The frozen Neva River and nearby forest became sources of food and fuel. Groups of men, sometimes armed, sometimes starving, would venture out to gather roots, dig up frozen bulbs, or catch fish through holes in the ice. Others trapped stray cats and dogs. Pets were eaten. The line between scavenging and crime blurred. One particularly grim source of food was the nutritional cakes. compressed blocks of dried fish scales and bones, processed by the Institute of Nutrition. They were tasteless, often revolting, but provided vital proteins and minerals. Mothers gave small bites to children who sometimes refused them, but could not survive without them. Medical reports from hospitals detailed the toll. Starvation weakened. Immune systems and diseases spread rapidly. Tuberculosis, typhus, and dysentery were rampant. The city's hospitals, also on rations, became overcrowded and understaffed. Doctors had to prioritize who could be treated. Amid this desperation, the social fabric strained and shifted. Friends and families were torn apart by hunger and fear. There are recorded instances of theft, violence, and even cannibalism, taboo subjects in Soviet historiography, but documented in secret diaries and post-war testimonies. Yet, paradoxically, many also reported acts of profound solidarity. People shared their last morsels. Collective kitchens and soup lines operated, often staffed by volunteers. Factory workers pooled resources. Children formed informal groups to share food and comfort. Cultural life, surprisingly, endured. Concerts, theaters, and lectures continued, sometimes in basements or bomb shelters. This was not merely defiance, but a vital psychological anchor, a reminder that the city was still alive. A particularly poignant story comes from the famous composer Dmitri Shostakovich, who wrote his Seventh Symphony during the siege. Its premiere, in 1942, performed by musicians who themselves were on starvation rations, became a symbol of endurance. The music was broadcast across the city, bolstering morale amid the hunger. All this against a backdrop of constant death and cold. The human body became a battleground. People lost weight rapidly, dropping from healthy weights of 70-80 kilograms to 40 or less. Men and women suffered hair loss, swelling limbs, and muscle atrophy. Children faced stunted growth and developmental delays. What helped many survive was not only food, but community, routine, and hope. Those who maintained a daily schedule, queuing for bread, attending to work duties, singing songs, or caring for others, had higher chances of survival. The Soviet government tried to maintain normalcy through propaganda, emphasizing the city's invincibility, but many citizens privately doubted the outcome. The psychological weight of starvation was enormous. Hunger dulls thought and will. Yet the people of Leningrad persisted. One anecdote recorded by a German officer after the war noted how the citizens, despite their suffering, did not break. It was not just discipline, it was the power of small rituals, the sharing of tea, the breaking of bread, even if bitter, even if scant. But as winter dragged on and food grew scarcer, the city's population thinned. Evacuations by river barges and ice roads saved tens of thousands, but many remained trapped. A question hangs heavy. In the face of such deprivation, what measures could a society take to preserve not just bodies, but humanity itself? By the dawn of 1944, the siege of Leningrad had lasted over 2 years and 4 months. 872 days of relentless encirclement, starvation, and winter's chill. But the city endured. The Soviet forces had steadily pushed back the German armies. In January 1943, a daring offensive broke the blockade's southern edge, opening a narrow land corridor, though full relief would come later. Finally, on January 2nd, 1944, the siege was officially lifted. The city, however, was forever changed. The immediate aftermath was grim. Nearly 1 million people had died, mostly from starvation and disease. Entire neighborhoods were empty or destroyed. The survivors were thin shadows of their former selves, bearing physical and psychological scars. Food supplies, though restored, remained insufficient for months. The ration system was recalibrated for post-siege realities, but malnutrition lingered. Many who survived the siege faced chronic health problems throughout their lives. Yet, beyond the statistics and the physical toll, there was something else, a memory of survival so deeply etched it shaped the city's identity. Leningrad's people had faced an unimaginable test, one of endurance measured not by military victories alone, but by daily, often invisible acts, lining up in bitter cold for a slice of bread, sharing scant resources, keeping bakeries running, holding on to hope. In the decades after the war, the siege became a powerful symbol in Soviet and Russian culture, a testament to the resilience of ordinary people and the complex machinery of survival that sustained them. Monuments rose, memorials were built, and museums were dedicated to the siege and its hardships. Recipes for siege bread, ration cards, and personal diaries were preserved, not just as historical artifacts but as reminders of the human cost behind the grand narratives of war. The siege also shaped scientific research. Nutritionists studied how the human body responded to prolonged starvation, and how limited diets impacted health and recovery. This knowledge influenced public health policies in the Soviet Union and beyond. And yet, the story of the siege is not just about death or deprivation. It is about the unseen networks, the bakers who kept ovens burning, the drivers who braved the road of life, the scientists who sought every scrap of nutrition, and the families who shared what little they had. It is about the quiet dignity of daily survival, the rhythms of rationing and baking, and the way food, however bitter or meager, became a symbol of life itself. So when you think of Leningrad during the war, you might picture the guns, the snow, the freezing winds. But beneath all that is something softer, quieter. The scent of siege bread, the crackle of frozen flour, the hum of a city that refused to starve. And you might wonder, what small acts of endurance are we overlooking today? Those quiet rituals that hold societies together when everything else falls away? The paper fortress, how medieval libraries survived war and decay. Imagine a world without digital backups, without photocopies, without the convenience of cloud storage. A world where knowledge, history, and culture depended entirely on fragile sheets of parchment, hand-copied manuscripts, and the dim light of scribes' lamps. This is the world of the medieval library, a place where survival was not just a matter of stones and walls, but of delicate ink, weathered vellum, and the quiet vigilance of monks and scholars. You stand before a towering oak door, studded with iron nails, entering a scriptorium in the 13th century. Inside, dozens of scribes bend over their work tables, copying texts by candlelight, the scent of beeswax and old parchment heavy in the air. Outside, war drums beat faintly, distant but ominous. Medieval Europe was no stranger to conflict. Castles were besieged, armies marched, and flames often engulfed cities. But amid the noise of battle, there was a silent, slow siege happening in libraries. A battle against time, neglect, and destruction. Books, then, were precious. Each manuscript might take months or years to produce. Their value was immense, not just for their content, but for the effort embedded in every hand-painted illumination and every carefully penned letter. Despite their preciousness, medieval libraries faced constant threats. First, there was the war. Armies marching through territories often looted, burned, or dismantled religious institutions, which were the primary keepers of books. The Library of Monte Cassino, for example, was destroyed multiple times in different wars, with irreplaceable manuscripts lost to flames. Second, the environment. Parchment and vellum, though sturdy, are organic materials vulnerable to moisture, insects, and temperature fluctuations. Without proper storage and something rarely available, entire collections could rot or be eaten by pests. Third, neglect and politics. Libraries depended on patronage. If a monastery fell out of favor or a city's rulers changed, funding dried up. Books could be dispersed, sold, or left to decay. Yet some libraries survived, and not by accident. Monastic orders developed meticulous systems of cataloging and preservation. The Benedictine monks, for example, maintained scriptoria where manuscripts were regularly copied, repaired, and recopied, spreading texts across Europe. Their rules emphasized stewardship, not just study. Some medieval scholars advocated for libraries as sanctuaries for knowledge. In the 12th century, Peter of Celle wrote of the library as a fortress of the mind, a place that could withstand the chaos outside. And so the medieval library became a paradoxical space, simultaneously fragile and resilient. Even during sieges, monks risked their lives to carry precious codices to safety. There are stories of monks hiding manuscripts in walls, burying them in secret caches, or smuggling them out under the cover of night. The survival of texts was not just about preservation, it was about the transmission of culture, faith, law, and science. The loss of a single manuscript could mean the disappearance of entire branches of knowledge. Take, for instance, the fate of the Library of Alexandria. Though long destroyed before the medieval era, it became a symbol of lost knowledge, a cautionary tale whispered in medieval cloisters reminding monks of their sacred duty. In this delicate dance between preservation and destruction, ordinary people often played extraordinary roles. One humble scribe copying a classical text might unknowingly safeguard the only surviving version of a work. One librarian's decision to rebinding a damaged book could preserve it for centuries. Even the marginal notes in manuscripts, scribbled reminders, corrections, or personal reflections, offer historians glimpses into lives long past. But the question remains, how did these fragile collections exposed to war, decay, and neglect endure long enough to reach us today? And what does their survival tell us about human priorities in the midst of chaos? The medieval library was more than a building. It was a living organism sustained by the tireless dedication of its caretakers. In an era when books were scarce and precious, their survival often hinged on the vigilance and sacrifice of a few individuals. Consider the monks and scribes, the guardians of knowledge, whose daily toil involved copying texts by hand. Each manuscript was a painstaking work of art. Letters formed with quills dipped in ink made from oak galls, pages illuminated with gold leaf, and vivid colors extracted from minerals and plants. This painstaking process was slow, sometimes months, or years to produce a single volume. But it was more than mere reproduction. Scribes corrected errors, added commentary, and sometimes even expanded on the texts, transforming copying into an act of scholarship. These caretakers worked under constant pressure. Political upheavals, invasions, and internal church reforms disrupted their work. Libraries were often attached to monasteries, abbeys, or cathedral schools, places not immune to the chaos of medieval power struggles. For instance, the dissolution of the monasteries in 16th century England led to the destruction or dispersal of thousands of manuscripts. Many libraries were dismantled, manuscripts sold off or lost. But in earlier centuries, when war threatened, monks developed ingenious methods to protect their collections. When the Normans invaded England in 1066, some monastic communities hid their treasures by burying manuscripts underground or secreting them in hidden chambers. The monks of St. Gall in Switzerland concealed precious texts behind false walls. This was not mere hoarding. It was a conscious attempt to preserve cultural memory against the ravages of violence and time. Even routine maintenance was an act of resistance. Books required regular care, pages had to be cleaned, bindings repaired, and ink sometimes refreshed. The idea of restoration is often thought of as modern, but medieval librarians understood the necessity of ongoing preservation. Beyond the walls of monasteries, traveling scholars and diplomats played a role in transmitting knowledge across borders. Manuscripts were gifted, traded, or copied in distant lands. The famous Library of Córdoba in Islamic Spain, for example, became a center of learning where Christian, Jewish, and Muslim scholars exchanged texts and ideas. Through these exchanges, medieval libraries became hubs in a vast network of knowledge, crossing religious and cultural boundaries. However, even the best intentions could not always save texts from destruction. Fires were a constant hazard. Illuminated manuscripts, made of highly flammable materials, could be consumed in minutes. Entire collections perished in accidental blazes or deliberate acts during wars. Moreover, changing intellectual fashions sometimes led to deliberate purging. The burning of heretical texts was common, as authorities sought to control what knowledge survived. Yet despite these threats, medieval libraries did not vanish. Some survived intact or in part due to the sheer redundancy built into the manuscript culture. Multiple copies of important works existed across Europe. Even when a particular library was destroyed, versions of texts could often be found elsewhere. This redundancy was not accidental. Medieval scholars believed knowledge was communal and cumulative. Preserving it was an act of faith and duty. The scriptorium, the workshop where manuscripts were produced, was at the heart of this process. Some famous scriptoria, like those in the monasteries of Cluny or Monte Cassino, became renowned for their quality and volume of work. Their output shaped what we now recognize as the Western literary and scientific tradition. Still, a pressing question remains. In a world where knowledge was so fragile, how did medieval societies decide what was worth preserving? And what was lost forever in the gaps between these precious manuscripts? As the centuries rolled on, the fragile paper and parchment manuscripts of the medieval libraries weathered countless storms, both literal and figurative. Fires, wars, neglect, and even deliberate destruction thinned their numbers. Yet what remains today stands as a testament to the resilience of human knowledge and the care of generations of custodians. The Renaissance sparked renewed interest in these ancient texts. Scholars rediscovered forgotten works, sometimes in crumbling libraries or private collections. The invention of the printing press in the 15th century revolutionized the preservation and dissemination of knowledge, making books more accessible and less fragile. But the medieval manuscript tradition did not disappear overnight. Manuscripts continued to be copied and treasured in universities and monasteries well into the early modern period. The painstaking craftsmanship of medieval scribes influenced bookmaking, illustration, and scholarship. Today, many medieval manuscripts survive in libraries, museums, and private collections worldwide, some beautifully illuminated, others worn and faded, but all invaluable windows into the past. Modern technologies now offer new means to preserve and share these treasures. Digitization projects aim to photograph and archive manuscripts, making them accessible to scholars and curious minds everywhere, without risking the original documents. This effort continues the centuries-old mission of guardianship, now aided by digital tools rather than quills and ink. But the legacy of medieval libraries is not merely in their physical volumes. It is also in the ideas they preserved, the knowledge they transmitted, and the human dedication behind them. The medieval library reminds us that knowledge is both fragile and powerful. It requires constant care and attention to survive the ravages of time and conflict. It asks us to consider the choices societies make about what knowledge to protect, how to pass it forward, and what to risk losing. In an age where information is abundant but often ephemeral, reflecting on the painstaking efforts of medieval scribes can be grounding. Their world was slower, more vulnerable, yet filled with a determination to keep human wisdom alive against all odds. So as you rest and drift off to sleep, you might ponder, what knowledge from our time, encoded in our digital and physical archives, will survive the test of centuries? What stories will future generations uncover about the care we took to preserve the past? The unseen workhorses, the history of road building and its quiet impact. When you think about history, you might picture kings, battles, or grand monuments, but beneath the surface of every civilization lies a vast network of something far less glamorous: roads. Not the smooth highways of today, but rough, muddy tracks, stone causeways, and packed dirt paths forged by generations of unseen labor. Roads are often called the veins of civilization, carrying people, goods, ideas, and armies. Yet the history of road building is rarely told in detail. It's a story of simple materials, endless toil, and the slow, steady shaping of landscapes. Long before asphalt and concrete, roads were made from the earth itself. A track beaten down by repeated footfalls or the wheels of carts could become a route for trade or travel. But such roads were vulnerable to weather, overgrowth, and erosion. One of the earliest known organized road systems was built by the ancient Sumerians in Mesopotamia, around 4000 BCE. These were mostly dirt tracks, connecting cities and farmlands. The heavy rains of the region turned them into quagmires, making travel difficult. To improve mobility, people added gravel or stones in some areas, but these were local solutions rather than a science. The ancient Romans are often credited with pioneering durable roads, and for good reason. Their network of viae stretched over 400,000 kilometers at the empire's height. Roman roads featured multiple layers, large stones at the base, smaller stones and gravel above, and tightly fitted paving stones on top. This design gave them remarkable durability. Many Roman roads survive today, some still in use. But what's often overlooked is the immense human labor behind their construction. Thousands of soldiers, slaves, and local workers dug, quarried, and hauled materials, often under harsh conditions. Road building was not just a military or administrative task, it was a public work that shaped economic and social life. In medieval Europe, however, much of the Roman infrastructure fell into disrepair. Without centralized authority or funding, roads reverted to muddy trails. Travel slowed, commerce diminished, and regions became more isolated. Some medieval cities built paved streets, but the larger networks were fragile and inconsistent. In Asia, the Silk Road flourished as a network of routes linking east and west. These were often caravan tracks crossing deserts and mountains, less engineered but vital for trade and cultural exchange. The history of roads is also a history of adaptation and innovation. Road builders experimented with drainage ditches, embankments, and paving materials suited to local environments. For example, in the swampy lands of the Netherlands, wooden planks and causeways supported travel over marshes. Despite their practical importance, roads were rarely glamorous or well-funded. Their maintenance was a constant struggle, often left to local communities or itinerant laborers. In many cases, roads were built and repaired piecemeal, reflecting the patchwork nature of political power and economic resources. So, when you consider the humble road beneath your feet, remember, it is the product of centuries of human effort, sweat, and ingenuity, often overlooked but vital. And you might ask, how did these slow, laborious developments in road building quietly transform societies, economies, and even empires over time? As roads slowly improved from muddy trails to engineered routes, their impact on societies deepened. Roads became more than just paths. They became arteries of commerce, culture, and control. The Roman roads exemplify this transformation. Built primarily for military efficiency, these roads enabled legions to move swiftly across vast territories, keeping the empire cohesive and responsive. But the roads also allowed merchants and travelers to connect distant cities, spreading goods, ideas, and customs. Local economies flourished along these routes. Roadside inns, markets, and stables catered to travelers, while towns near road junctions often grew into bustling centers. The maintenance of these roads was a constant challenge, involving local populations conscripted into labor or taxed to pay for repairs. Roman engineers developed techniques for drainage and cambered surfaces to shed water, crucial for longevity. Yet, even the best roads required continual upkeep, highlighting an often unseen aspect of infrastructure, the labor behind its preservation. Moving into the Middle Ages, the collapse of centralized Roman authority fragmented road networks. In Western Europe, political fragmentation and frequent warfare meant roads deteriorated, travel became perilous, and long-distance commerce slowed. However, some roads retained their importance, especially pilgrimage routes. The Camino de Santiago, in Spain for example, drew pilgrims from across Europe, sustaining local economies and fostering cultural exchange. Elsewhere, in the Islamic world, road systems linked vast territories from Spain to Persia. Caravanserais, roadside inns, provided safety and rest for travelers and their animals, supporting trade routes like the Silk Road. In Asia, the Grand Canal of China complemented road networks, facilitating transport of goods and people along waterways. Roads connected the canal hubs to hinterlands, knitting together diverse regions. The Mongol Empire in the 13th century reinvigorated trade routes across Eurasia, ensuring road safety and communication through the Yam system, relay, stations supplying food and horses to messengers, This system accelerated the flow of information and goods. Back in Europe, the late medieval period saw gradual improvements. Kings and cities invested in road repairs to stimulate trade. The rise of markets and fairs depended on better transport routes. Yet roads remained uneven in quality and often limited to well-traveled corridors. The dawn of the early modern period introduced new challenges and opportunities. Increased trade, exploration, and urbanization demanded better roads. In England, the establishment of turnpike trusts in the 17th and 18th centuries marked an important shift. These trusts, funded by tolls, built and maintained roads systematically, introducing user fees and improving accountability. This model spread and laid foundations for modern road infrastructure. The Industrial Revolution accelerated the need for reliable transport. Roads facilitated the movement of raw materials to factories and finished goods to markets. Despite innovations in canals and railways, roads remained essential for short-distance travel and rural connectivity. Yet, throughout these developments, the essence of road building stayed the same. It was hard, unglamorous work relying on local labor, materials, and maintenance. Roads shaped empires not just through military conquest, but by enabling economies to grow, people to migrate, and cultures to mingle. And they did so quietly, often taken for granted, their significance hidden beneath layers of dirt and stone. This leads us to wonder, in what ways have these unseen networks of roads, built through sweat and persistence, influenced the course of human history far beyond their humble surfaces? As you walk or drive along modern highways, it's easy to forget the long and laborious history that brought us here. The sleek asphalt beneath your feet or tires carries the weight of thousands of years of human effort, innovation, and adaptation. The 19th and 20th centuries transformed road building with new materials, machinery, and engineering methods. The invention of macadamized roads by John Loudon Macadam introduced layered crushed stone surfaces that allowed for better drainage and durability without costly paving stones. Later, the rise of the automobile accelerated road development, leading to vast networks of paved highways connecting cities and countries. But despite technological advances, many challenges remain constant. Roads require continuous upkeep, repairing potholes, reinforcing foundations, and managing erosion. Weather still erodes surfaces, heavy use degrades structures, and funding for maintenance remains a political and economic challenge. Interestingly, many modern roads trace their origins to ancient paths, following routes established by early civilizations. The Appian Way in Italy, built over 2,000 years ago, still forms a part of today's road system. This continuity reminds us that roads are not just infrastructure. They are living histories, carrying stories of conquest, trade, migration, and daily life. The economic and social impacts of roads continue to ripple through societies. They connect rural areas to urban centers, enable emergency services, and facilitate globalization. Yet, as society grows increasingly dependent on roads, questions arise about sustainability, environmental impact, and equity. Who gets to build and maintain roads? Whose communities benefit? Whose histories are preserved along these routes? The story of road building teaches us that infrastructure is deeply tied to power, culture, and human resilience. It is an ongoing project shaped by countless hands, often unrecognized. As you close your eyes, you might reflect on this. The next time you travel a road, consider the unseen workhorses, those countless laborers, planners, and maintainers, who, through generations, have crafted the paths that quietly shape your world. How will the roads we build today be remembered by future generations? What stories will they uncover beneath the asphalt and gravel? The invisible web, how ancient sewers and sanitation shaped cities. When we think of ancient cities, the impressive walls, temples, and marketplaces often come to mind. But beneath the surface, an equally important and often overlooked infrastructure was quietly evolving. The systems that managed human waste and water. Sanitation might sound mundane, even unpleasant, but it was fundamental to the survival and growth of early cities. Without ways to remove waste and provide clean water, urban life as we know it would have been impossible. Some of the earliest evidence of sanitation comes from the ancient city of Indus Valley Civilization, circa 500 BCE, in present-day Pakistan and India. Excavations of cities like Mohenjo-Daro reveal sophisticated drainage systems with covered brick-lined channels running alongside streets. These drains connected to individual homes, where waste was funneled away, reducing contamination and the spread of disease. This level of urban planning was exceptional for its time. Many contemporary cities in Mesopotamia or Egypt had less developed systems, often relying on open cesspits or rudimentary canals. The Greeks and Romans later advanced sanitation infrastructure significantly. The Greeks built public latrines, aqueducts, and drainage systems, but it was the Romans who took sanitation to a new scale. Rome's famous Cloaca Maxima, one of the world's earliest sewage systems, channeled waste from the city into the Tiber River. This enormous stone tunnel began as an open canal and was gradually covered and expanded over centuries. Roman aqueducts delivered fresh water to public baths, fountains, and private homes, supporting hygiene practices uncommon in many ancient societies. Bathhouses became social hubs, and running water reduced the prevalence of waterborne diseases, though understanding of germs was centuries away. But sanitation systems required constant care and maintenance. Blockages could cause floods or disease outbreaks. Skilled workers, often slaves or lower-class laborers, were responsible for cleaning drains, repairing aqueducts, and maintaining pipes. The wealth and stability of a city often determined the quality of its sanitation. When the Roman Empire declined, many of these systems fell into disrepair. Cities shrank, populations dropped, and open sewers returned in many places. Despite this, some sanitation knowledge survived through the Byzantine Empire and Islamic cities, where public baths and waterworks remained important. Throughout the Middle Ages in Europe, sanitation regressed in many urban centers. Open ditches, cesspits, and even throwing waste into the streets were common practices. These conditions contributed to recurring plagues and diseases, shaping the health and demographics of populations. Still, human ingenuity and necessity ensured that sanitation systems continued to evolve, even if unevenly. So, as you reflect on the invisible channels beneath ancient cities, you might wonder, how did these early sanitation efforts quietly influence the health, growth, and daily lives of millions, shaping the fate of civilizations? Building sanitation infrastructure was only the first step. Maintaining it was a continuous, labor-intensive process that few appreciated, but many depended upon. In ancient Rome, for example, the Cloaca Maxima and aqueducts were feats of engineering, but they required regular upkeep to prevent blockages and contamination. Teams of workers, often slaves or the urban poor, were tasked with cleaning sewers and repairing cracks in aqueducts. This work was dangerous, unpleasant, and socially stigmatized, yet essential for the city's survival. The Roman government recognized this by appointing officials called curatores aquarum, responsible for overseeing water supply and sanitation. Maintenance of public baths, which were integral to Roman social and cultural life, depended heavily on a reliable flow of clean water and effective drainage systems. They were not only places to wash, but also centers for socializing and conducting business. Maintaining these facilities required a complex network of labor and administrative oversight. Outside Rome, other cities in the Roman Empire varied widely in sanitation quality. Wealthier cities often invested more in water infrastructure, while smaller towns relied on wells, cisterns, and cesspits. In the Byzantine capital of Constantinople, public baths and aqueducts continued to be maintained for centuries, reflecting the city's importance and wealth. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world during the medieval period, urban sanitation saw important developments. Cities like Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba implemented sophisticated waterworks including fountains, baths, and sewer systems. Islamic scholars also contributed to medical knowledge, understanding links between cleanliness and health long before germ theory. Public bathhouses, hammams, were widespread, serving hygiene and social functions similar to Roman baths. Despite these advancements, sanitation systems faced challenges. In many medieval European cities, sanitation was rudimentary. Waste disposal was often a private matter, leading to open cesspits, dumping into streets or nearby rivers. City ordinances sometimes banned throwing waste out of windows, but enforcement was inconsistent. The foul conditions contributed to periodic outbreaks of plague, typhus, and other diseases. In some places, efforts to improve sanitation were driven by public health crises. For example, in 14th century Venice, authorities regulated waste disposal and created canals to carry away sewage. In East Asia, ancient China developed sophisticated urban sanitation as well. Some cities had underground drainage and water distribution systems. Overall, the development of sanitation infrastructure was tightly linked to a city's wealth, governance, and social organization. Maintenance required a workforce often marginalized yet vital. The invisible web of sewers and pipes was a shared responsibility that reflected broader societal values and priorities. As you consider these hidden networks, you might ask, how did the social structures around sanitation work shape the health and social dynamics of ancient and medieval cities? Sanitation systems, though largely invisible and often ignored, have had an enduring impact on human societies. The lessons learned and the infrastructure built in ancient and medieval times laid the groundwork for modern public health and urban development. The Industrial Revolution brought rapid urbanization, creating new sanitation challenges. Overcrowded cities with inadequate waste disposal saw frequent outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and other waterborne diseases. These crises sparked innovations in engineering and public health policies. The design of sewer systems evolved from open ditches to covered underground channels, inspired in part by the ancient Roman model. Pioneers like Joseph Bazalgette in 19th century London engineered extensive sewer networks that helped control deadly epidemics and transformed urban life. Today, sanitation remains a critical issue worldwide. Billions still lack access to safe toilets and clean water, making ancient struggles with waste management eerily relevant. Modern sanitation engineering relies on a blend of ancient wisdom, scientific innovation, and massive infrastructure investment. Reflecting on the invisible web beneath our cities, it's clear sanitation is more than pipes and drains. It's a reflection of social priorities, public health, and human dignity. The work of countless nameless laborers through history, cleaning sewers, maintaining aqueducts, digging ditches, has shaped the very fabric of urban life. As you drift off to sleep, consider, what stories might the sewers beneath modern cities tell? How do our current sanitation choices reflect who we are and who we want to be as societies? And what can the quiet history of sanitation teach us about resilience, adaptation, and the unseen foundations of civilization?